Okay, so I'm gonna kick it off, right? Okay, perfect. Welcome.
Thank you for being here. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Margarete. Yes, so I'm very excited because the pinball is one of my favorite hobbies, and I try to also incorporate pinball into my professional life, which is kind of what I'm doing here right now. And hopefully you enjoy it too. So yeah, I'm trying to focus this talk on pinball as a gaming hybrid, and also as a physical performance play machine. What I mean with that, I will jump into while I'm giving this talk. So a little bit about me. I'm a game culture journalist with a focus on video games and pinball. The pinball is in parentheses because you can make a living on being a pinball journalist, unfortunately, but who knows. As I said, I work at ORF, Austrian Broadcasting Corporation, Radio FM4 for 20 years now, quite a long time. I'm a senior editor, and I founded FM4 Spielkultur, the game culture department within the radio station 6 years ago already. So since 2016, we have our own game culture department. Culture is very important because, as you may know, video games, like talking about video games publicly in a journalistic way, used to be very technical driven. You know, it was part of computer culture, and computer culture obviously was very technical. Also during journalistic views on those cultural artifacts. And I said to my editor, hey, we really need to look at video games the way we look at movies or literature, and so on and so forth. You also don't do a review on a film while only talking about how like the cameras are being set up, you know. But this was the case with video games. So yeah. I have a degree in audio engineering and communication studies. I finished quite some time ago in the mid 2000s, and my thesis was on games journalism in German-speaking countries. And this is also something that I revisit from time to time and write new texts and papers about. I have an academic focus. I sometimes write papers, but I'm first and foremost a journalist. So please bear with me. I won't come up with many citations and stuff, but hopefully other things that you might enjoy. Okay, so little overview about what you will be hearing throughout the next 30 minutes. Pinball, what is pinball anyway? Preconceptions about pinball. So what do people think about pinball if they don't really care about it that much? So anyway, who here in the audience has played a pinball machine within the last 1 or 2 years? Okay, the most. Within the last year? Okay, that's actually quite good. Amazing. Huh? Physical, yeah, correctly. Physical ones. Okay, still a few. Nice. Yeah. The relationship between actual physical pinball and video pinball is a story of its own. I will get into it a little bit, but not that much today. So yeah, I'm talking a little bit about history, about the hybrid nature of pinball as a game artifact, about skill and luck in terms of pinball, obviously. Art, storytelling, and spectacle. Spectacle is very important for pinball because it's meant to be in a public place, you know. So when you play pinball, you're not only performing for yourself, you're performing for the audience that, if you play well, will be surrounding you sooner or later. You and the machine. So what's the relationship between you as a player and the machine? And also very important, the techniques and what I like very much, the performing within playing pinball. And having fun with that. So what is pinball? You shoot a ball on a tilted playfield. It's usually tilted like that, you know, so the ball is rolling down. You try to keep the ball in play, mostly with the flipper fingers. You have the buttons, you have the flipper fingers. There are two at the bottom of the playfield, but sometimes there are more. And you hit targets. Usually you hit those targets that are blinking. So where the machine tells you, hey, hit here, so you get more points. Often you need a specific order. You need to hit some targets within a limited amount of time, which is not easy. Also for experienced players, if you really want to hit a certain target within, say, 5 seconds, it's not easy. You really have to focus, and sometimes it works, sometimes it don't. Sometimes it doesn't. So getting a high score, you can't win anything but high scores and free games. And you play with your body. You stand in front of the machine. You're touching the machine. You have to get in contact with it, and yeah, there is some kind of symbiosis going on, you know. And of course, having fun. So this is from a book that was recently published from John Chad. It's a pinball comic, basically, about the history of pinball. And this is what I was talking about earlier. So what's the big deal about pinball anyway? You know, so many people say, yeah, it's nice. It's in pubs and in bars, and people play, and then you have your ball. It's mostly based on luck. You know, sometimes you have bad luck. The ball runs out, it drains. And that's about it, you know. It has no real depth to it. You just keep the ball in play. Every pinball machine is basically the same. I mean, okay, you have those different brands, of course, it looks differently, but it's more or less the same. So these are the usual preconceptions about pinball. A little bit of history. It started in France about 1700. It's what was called bagatelle, and it was basically billiards. You know, it was flat, and you had your cue, and you shot with the cue the balls, and the balls you try to put the balls into some like holes, some kind of holes. It was really boring, basically. And then sometimes you had wooden sticks, and to try to shoot around the wooden sticks, but they it didn't really work out that well. And Billard Japonais and Stoßpudel from Austria, actually, was a little bit later, 50, 60 years later. It was smaller, and it was already tilted. And then the interesting thing, the spring launcher was introduced already before 1869. It was only patented back then. But it used to be much earlier than that, but it was patented, and this was the first interactive thing about pinball. You had your spring launcher. You have still this thing today. You launch the ball into the game with the spring launcher, and you can choose whether you really launch it like it hardly, strongly into the game, or just with just a little bit of energy, you know. So sometimes you hit certain targets when you slowly put the ball into play. So so as you see, I mean, most things started in Europe, and then the US made it big. And this is also pinball is also a big thing that really became big in the US. It started in the US in the 1930s. They were called pin games, and they immediately were a big success. It was the Great Depression back then, so people didn't really have much money. They didn't really know what to do in their spare time. It were tough times. So what did you do? You had, again, it was a public thing, pinball. And the interesting thing was also that pinball used to be very small. The first tilted pinball machines, they didn't stand on four legs as they do now, but you put them on a desk, basically, you know. So this is interesting because this is also from this graphic novel you see here. Like in 1931, those desktop tabletop pinball machines were very small, and they became like bigger and bigger throughout the 30s, and eventually they had the four legs as they have them today. So I told you that the spring launcher was the first interactive thing that was introduced into pinball. And then in 1947, so 15 years after pinball was introduced, over 15 years before after pinball was introduced into the market as a commercial product, we saw the first pinball machine that had flipper fingers. The thing where you usually say, this is the thing that every pinball machine needs. Without flipper fingers, it doesn't make any sense. But we had more than 15 years of commercial success with pinball machines where they didn't have them. So then eventually flippers had circuit boards, digital displays from the mid-70s and onwards. And then, of course, video games were introduced, and this was a big shock for pinball culture because video games were stronger, were more interesting, they were more flashy. And so this big rivalry between pinball and video games began. And this led eventually to a drought in the 2000s. In the 2000s, there was only one pinball manufacturing company, And this company made like 2 to 3 tables a year, and that was it. And the Renaissance started 2010 and onwards, and now we have actually quite a big culture again, but it's a niche compared to what was in the past. So yeah, this is again a graphic history of the silverball. This is this visual novel from John Chad. It was released earlier this year. And on the right, you see Steve Kordak and Wayne Nayans. Both those gentlemen were pinball designers, and they Wayne Nayans died recently. He became 104 years old. So designing pinball is promises you a long life, obviously. And Steve Kordak also is, I think he died when he was 101 or something. And they improved on the flipper fingers, because on the very, very first table, the flipper fingers were they were at a different spot. And Wayne Nayans eventually made the flipper fingers so how they are today, as you can see. So yeah, and this is interesting because you see really in the 30s and the 40s, flipper, like pinball, was a huge commercial success. They were smaller. There were many, many different machines. And then the quality became like better, but there were fewer machines from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then it was smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually video games almost killed pinball, but just almost. Yeah, it was very affordable. The fight was lost, but it was there were some years in the early 90s where pinball really started to fight against video games, but eventually it didn't work out that way. But pinball survived. So why is it a hybrid thing? It's a mixture between a digital game and a physical machine. Actually, there are many, many elements in modern pinball which are digital, the video modes, for example. So you play your physical pinball, and then you hit a certain target, and then the target lets you play a video game. You have this little screen, and then you play with your flipper buttons, escaping from the dog or something like that, you know? So this is really interesting, and this goes on since the 90s. It's a mixture between analog arcade culture and the electrification and the digitization of the attractions. When you go back to arcades from the 1800s or the early 1900s, so nothing was electrified, obviously, and became more and more electrified. And pinball actually made this transition in and with itself, because it started as a non-electrified thing, and then it became electrified, and then eventually it became digitized. So this is very interesting that, like, really pinball broadens this gap between old school, non-electrified arcade culture and the modern arcade culture. This is interesting, skill and luck. So many people say, well, there is no skill involved, you know, you just plunge the ball. Plunging is like the act of shooting the ball into the game, plunging the ball, and then you flip a little bit, and then the ball is lost, and that's it. So is it gambling? Actually, in the 30s, it was a little bit like gambling, because you didn't have to flip your fingers. You just could shoot the ball into the play field, and that was that, you know. You couldn't do much more than that. And people used it for gambling. So they said, okay, well, you two play, and the player wins, I don't know, $5,000 or something. So it was actually used for gambling, and it was part of the mob culture. So this is a fact, you know. But then it changed. There was this ban because of because of the mob culture. But eventually pinball evolved. The flipper fingers were introduced and stuff. And then there was this famous court situation in 1976 where they invited Roger Sharp. He was a pinball designer and a pinball player. And he said, well, I can show you that pinball is not a game of luck. It's a game of skill. Mm-hmm. And then he called some shots. He said, okay, well, now I'm going to shoot right here. And then I'm going to shoot this ramp, and I'm going to shoot this target. And then he did exactly that. And then they said, well, this seems good. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And there's this thing that Roger Sharp saved, the man who saved pinball. It was a very dramatic thing. It's often told story. But the funny thing is that Roger Sharp, if you ask him now, he says, well, I also had some luck by really hitting them at the first, because you normally, when you play pinball and you want to hit a certain target, usually you try 2 times, maybe 3 times, and the 4th time you're going to hit it. But hitting something the first time, you say, okay, now I'm going to do this, and now this is very, very hard. So it was luck involved. And this is also fitting to pinball culture itself, because luck is an important part, but it's actually a smaller factor that you shouldn't forget, but it's also not that interesting and that important. And this is a little ad from the 90s, I think. It's very interesting because it's an ad about what you do when you are a gambling addict. So please call this number if you know someone who is an addict. And they say, so this is not just like pinball, because pinball is just a fun game. It's a fun game of skill, but it used to be a gambling thing too. It's kind of an irony, you know.
The game is just a game. It's how you play that makes it fun, or something else entirely. Most people look at gambling like they look at pinball, as a form of entertainment. But the 3% of Oregonians who may have a gambling problem see something very different. If someone you know has lost perspective on the game, there is help. Call 1-877-2-STOP-NOW or log on to OregonLotteryHelp.org. Treatment is free, confidential, and it works.
Yeah, so by that time, people were obviously convinced that pinball wasn't a gambling thing anymore, which is great, obviously. So let's get to the art of pinballs, how pinball tells stories, and the big thing, the spectacle of pinball. So the basic pinball features mostly stayed the same throughout the decades. You have the flipper fingers since 1947. You have the bumpers, you have the ramps, you have drop targets, you have stand-up targets. All those things exist until today. But they get elevated by embedding them within a setting, within a story, a purpose. You have a small world within a confined space within this pinball machine, and it really comes to life when you shoot things, when you unlock things, when you get to unlock a secret, when someone talks to you within the pinball. You always have a setting, let's say like Terminator or Jurassic Park or like a rock band. There's also kind of a thing. There are many band pinball. I think there are like 4 Rolling Stones pinball machines throughout the last decades. So this is something that's really interesting. I want to show you a trailer of one of the newest pinball machines. It's a 007 James Bond. It will come out, I think, right now, within the next weeks or so. And so you see like the theming and the setting of a pinball machine and how it elevates like those basic pinball elements to a story, basically, you know? So imagine all this without the setting, without the sounds, without the art design of the play field and whatnot. It would be boring. Yeah. You mean, yeah, there is always a display. Usually it was like those old letters where you just had the numbers. And since the 80s and 90s, you have those DMD displays, where you also play those video game modes and where you see your points. And some of the newer machines also have like big screens, basically. Yeah. It's also some people like the big screens more. Some people like the old school, the smaller screens more. But yeah, this is the thing, because when you play, you obviously look onto the play field, and you shouldn't look too often upwards, because then you lose the ball because you lost track of the ball. So yeah, art, sound, music, game design, but also physical necessities. When you design a pinball machine, you need to account for distances, angles, sturdiness, you know. Pinball machines, all the elements really need to be sturdy. Why? We come to that later. There are multiple layers of intensity that can be achieved. The longer you play, the more things you unlock, and the bigger the spectacle becomes. There are special modes, missions, and most of the time end games, where you have to like fight against a big enemy or something. All those things are hidden within, and the more and more you play, and the more successful you are, the more you see, and the bigger the spectacle becomes. The machine makes noises, and again, it's supposed to be in a public place. And when you play pinball, when you get a free play, this is something that you really try to achieve, because then you can play another game after you finish the current one, and it makes a big knock, you know. And that's supposed to lure all the people. Oh, someone made a free play, someone made a replay game. There has to be a person in the room who plays pinball really well, you know. So everyone should notice that. This is again from the book from John Chad. You see how this works with the interaction of music, illustration, kinetics, and sounds. It's not about shooting the ball, it's about getting away from the cops, for instance. So this is interesting. This is a video from 1979, the year that I was born. And it's actually interesting because there is a young woman who was a synthesizer nerd, basically, and she did the sounds and the sound effects for pinball machines back then. She was called in to really bring this pinball machine to life. It was called Xenon, and the pinball machine should speak to you while you play it. This was something that was very novel, 1979, obviously. I won't show you the whole thing, but let's take a little look into this video.
Welcome to Xenon. Welcome to Xenon. Welcome to Xenon. Welcome to Xenon. Welcome to Xenon.
Suzanne Ciani, electronic composer. She captures the indefinable and turns it into music. A pinball manufacturer has asked her to design special sounds for a new game.
Okay, so we're going to start off on the background sound.
A double challenge, sounds and voices that would play off each other.
I was very interested in getting the whole composition to work, to think of the pinball as actually playing a piece. Because I think to add excitement to the game, that the background sound should speed up as you play the game.
Pinball Symphony, a whole new world.
The idea of using the short grunts and groans came to me when I watched people playing the game, the way that people expressed their frustrations or their involvement with the game. And I wanted the game to do that back. I wanted it to talk back to the people playing.
It'd be good for when they lose the ball.
So emotion is obviously very important, not just because you want to keep the ball in the game, but because the pinball machine wants to enchant you in a way. So you and the machine is your foe and your ally. You just want to get a good high score, you want to have a good time while playing, but it's tricky because the pinball machine wants you to lose the ball too. So you really have to focus and really try to keep the ball in play. But it's also your ally, obviously, because playing pinball is fun, and you also are going into a symbiosis with the machine because you're touching it and you try to shove it a little bit. We come to that later on. There is this famous quote from Harry Williams, who was one of the very first and very famous pinball designers. He said, "The ball is wild." So the thing is, the machine is your foe. He wants you to lose the ball, and you can try to control the ball, and you do control the ball. The more you play, the better you become, the more skilled you become. But you can never control the ball completely, because there is always randomness involved. because the ball always does something that you can't control. And this is also an interesting lesson for yourself, that you have to let go of certain things that you can't control. You can't control how to play a pinball machine. You can play a pinball machine really well, but still you can never control the ball completely because the ball is wild. Also important is that not just every game is different, every single machine is different. And if you have a table, say when you have, say, a Rolling Stones pinball machine from the 70s, and you have like, say, I don't know how many were produced, say 15,000, then you have one of those 15,000, and you play on this Rolling Stones machine, and you really know the game inside and out. You know every shot, you know how to do your shots, you know everything. And then you go into an arcade in, I don't know, in Canada, there is the same machine, except it's not the same machine, it's just the same model. And you play this machine that you know because you have the same model at home, but then you realize, my shots they don't work. Why do they don't work? Because the tilt is different, because the play field is maybe older or not cleaned. The balls are different. The flippers are set up differently. Every machine is different. And this is also something that's very intriguing when you play. And this is also something where you have to be modest as a player. You have to know, okay, I know this table, except I don't because I didn't play this exact table. So this is very interesting. And sometimes this can become a problem, because when you think, oh, I have like 10 pinball machines at home, and when I'm gonna like encounter those machines in the wild, I know how to play them. But it's not true. You know how to play these models, but you don't know how to play these exact machines. So I have some small videos still prepared for you. We come to techniques and performance, and this is interesting because the interactivity with pinball, how does it come about? It comes about the two, sometimes more, flipper buttons. The buttons on the side of the cabinet, left and right, and to control the flipper fingers. At the bottom, sometimes also at different places on the playfield. They are not really on-off switches. I mean, they are, but they are not at the same time. It's not that you just press and then release, and that's it. You can just press it a little bit, and then the finger goes up just a little bit, or it doesn't even go up. You don't even see it. The ball moves. You will see it in a video just now, but the flipper finger doesn't move. So it's not an on-off switch. You have the plunger, where you put the ball into play. You have a start button. Sometimes you also have an action button. There is from Tyrol a pinball player who makes amazing tutorial videos. Let's see one of those.
Welcome, my name is Abraham, and here I'm gonna explain to you pinball skills in depth. Microflip skill set. Microflips are done by releasing and pushing the flipper button very quickly, and they are mainly used to keep the ball under control. In combination with other techniques, the full potential of microflips can be achieved, which I will explain to you now. Flick pass. If a rolling ball is too slow for a ski pass, you can use a microflip to pass the ball to the other side. When the ball comes down the in-lane, you can also take away its momentum by hitting it with the base of the flipper and set up a more precise pass. Stopping the ball. If you don't want to transfer the rolling ball, you can also stop it with the help of a microflip. It's done like a flick pass, just earlier. This is especially useful during multi-ball, because you can cradle up and think about your next shot. Be aware of the ball jumping back to the in-lane, because making contact with the metal causes the ball to accelerate towards the middle. Setting up your backflips. Microflipping a cradled ball can set up backflips which can hit targets from an extreme angle. This wouldn't be possible with common backhanded shots from a cradle. You can practice your microflip skills by starting from a position where the ball is trapped. Combine all three techniques with the goal to regain ball control. Those techniques are mostly affected by game steepness, flipper angle, and flipper rubbers. Good luck.
Yeah, and you see, this is achieved by just pressing just a little bit, so that the flipper finger actually doesn't move, but it does move. You just don't see it, but the ball knows that you did something. So this is one of my favorite things in pinball: nudging the machine. You just don't play with the buttons. Obviously, this is the most important thing, but But the second most important thing, so to say, is nudging the machine, pushing it, shoving it a little bit, giving not too much, of course, but a little bit, so that you prevent the ball from draining, which is the basic idea of pinball play. This is a legitimate action. This is important. This is not something that's like illegal or not. You shouldn't do that because that's not supposed to do. That's not supposed to be in a game. No, this is a legitimate and an important action by the player. And if you want to really play pinball well, you need to nudge the machine. You need to push the machine. Controlled, of course, and you need to know what you're doing, not just shove it around like an idiot, but you need to nudge the machine. So there is another, and also, but if you nudge the machine and shove the machine and push it around, people do that. People do what they can do, and if you don't say to them, "That's enough now, stop now, it's too much," they just do it, you know. So we have the tilt bob, and there is a video by a Danish pinball fan. He's called Søren Vore, and he explains to us what the tilt bob is. It sounds like a little bit abstract, but it's actually not.
Let me start with a brief rundown of the tilt mechanism. The tilt is a simple mechanical plumb bob that is set in motion when the pinball cabinet is nudged, pushed, and shaken by the player. Tilt mechanisms vary from era to era and from manufacturer to manufacturer, but basically they all work the same way. The plumb is caught inside a ring. If it swings to the limit and touches the ring, the game registers this electronically. This will eventually tilt the game, making the player lose the ball in play and the bonus points for that ball. Games allow a typical 2 contacts before the player is finally punished with the tilt. These are referred to as tilt warnings or dangers. The plumb is conical, allowing the sensitivity to be adjusted by its position on the threaded pendulum. The tilt is a very important part of the game of pinball. Without it, it becomes too easy to steer the ball out of danger by pushing the game. Contrary, on a game with a very sensitive tilt, a player is not able to make even the slightest bump to the game, and the game becomes less controllable, and the outcome more left to chance. Ideally, the tilt configuration should allow a certain level of physical play and subtle nudging. The nature of pinball. And when a player makes a reasonable, yet rougher move, exceeding this level, the game should not tilt right away, but have an intermediate range where only tilt warnings are issued.
Yeah, the nature of pinball. Well put. So I have 2 more small videos from Abraham Siedler from Tyrol. Again, he's the one with the pinball tutorials. And I show you 2 things, how nudging works exactly and what the slap save is, which I also like very much. At first, when you're not really keen on playing pinball, you don't really do it because it's not a natural thing to do, to shove the pinball machine. But then when you really start doing it, it really becomes a very nice habit. And again, it's not about like just pushing the machine, it's about like controlled movement.
Slap save. The slap save is an important emergency response, and you will be shocked how many balls you can save with it. Never watch a ball going straight down the middle without even trying to save it, unless the tilt is set up particularly tight. Slapping the flipper button and cabinet at the same time extend the flipper's reach by moving the playfield under the ball. Slap saves won't affect the tilt bob too much, since the impacts are hard and short and the second slap recenters the machine. Judge which flipper is closer to the ball, or if you're not sure, start with your dominant hand. Slap the flipper button, followed up by a second slap with the other hand. The first flipper should hit the ball at a horizontal angle for maximum reach, and the second flipper flails away the ball, with the downside of losing ball control. If your flipper's reach wasn't enough, a nudge pass always could have saved the ball. However, nudge passes will affect the tilt much more than a slap save. For slower balls in the area between the flippers, slap saves are your best friend. You can save balls from unfortunate rebounds, failed microflips and rolling balls off the flipper's tip. This will step up your juggling game to the next level. You also can slap the machine just once, with the goal to get the ball to the opposite inlane or flipper area. This requires some experience, and you have to take the strong impact on the tilt bob into account due to the one-directional force. nudging. You can alter the ball's speed and direction in which it rebounds from various obstacles on the playfield by slightly moving the machine, also known as nudging. There are left, right and upward nudges, or you can even slap, shake or pull the machine. Keep in mind that you're moving the machine under the ball, not the ball itself. However, nudging too hard affects the tilt ball and you might get a tilt warning. The wonderful art of nudging plays a huge role in pinball, and if you want to compete in tournaments, there's no way around it.
Yeah, last but not least, performance. I mean, the nudging in itself is kind of a performance because you also have the right stance with your body to really perform those actions really well. Because if you stand like this, you can't really do anything. If you like bend over and then you don't have the real a good stance with the machine. So play with your body while doing a game of pinball. It's very important to really find a good spot where you really feel safe and you feel like have a sturdy pace and where you can do like your moves and where you see the ball, because you really need to find the correct angle. Some players like stay like this and some players play like that, you know. So you really have to get to know how you really perform well, how you really hit a target well, because some people, you know, they should shoot like, I can't play like that. It's impossible. I'm this kind of player. And you see that this is a YouTuber, Pinball Jan, and she shows us some of those pinball stances, which are very important in my opinion. So let's get back to the preconceptions we had in the beginning, revisited. Pinball is a game based mostly on luck. Is not true. As you just saw with Abe Flips and all his nudging skills, there is luck involved, but it's not an important factor. Pinball has no depth to it is also not true because, as you saw, there are many different themes and there are tutorials over tutorials for all those tables, and you can really deep dive into every single pinball machine, except older ones. You know, machines from the 50s and 60s are not that deep, but starting from the 70s and 80s onwards, some 90s especially, 90s pinball tables are very, very multi-layered and multifaceted. And every pinball machine is the same. Obviously, it's not. But I understand people, you know, when you don't really know much about pinball and nobody shows you, but I have shown you now, nobody shows you, you can't really grasp like the depth of it. So there you have it. This is basically, this is also from John Chad, like the realization that pinball is so much more than the sum of its parts. And yeah, unfortunately, by now in Europe, you don't see many pinball machines in the wild and public places. It's different in the US and in Canada because they have more space. They have more, like pinball culture is more important there than in Austria or Germany, for example. But you can go to Wiener Prater, obviously. There are always pinball machines. And there are not so few pubs in Vienna, actually. There are some of my pinball friends here as well. You know, you can go to a pub and there is maybe one or two pinball machines. So have an eye out for that and try a game if you see one. So yeah, that's me. That was the pinball performance play machine. Thank you.
Would you say that the pinball game for Windows XP had a noticeable influence on the pinball culture?
You mean the Space Cadet from the late 90s? Definitely, yeah. Many people know pinball throughout because of this Space Cadet pinball machine, as it was included within Windows 95, I think, or XP, yeah. I think 95 maybe too, right? No, 95, okay. Yeah, because when you ask kids or like younger adults even, they sometimes haven't played a pinball, or haven't seen a pinball machine, and some of them think that it's a video game. And when they see it, like the real physical thing is, oh, this exists, you know. So this is interesting. Of course, video games helped. Also, it's like double faceted, because at one point, video games, like the arcade video games from the early 80s and early 90s, there was this rivalry between arcade video games and pinball in public spaces. But then eventually pinball won this war, if you will. But then again, through other video pinball games, video games made like advertisers for pinball. So people were attracted to playing a video pinball game and then said, hey, I have to try the real one now.
And it's seldom that you normally you don't hit a machine.
Yeah, normally if you do that, you're not supposed to hit a machine or to shove a machine. Yeah. And this is the thing, because when you don't know about it, when you don't know about pinball culture, you say, oh, that's not allowed. That's a shady thing to do. You shouldn't just play the game. It's like throwing a video game controller around. No, that's not the same thing. That's not the same thing at all.
So you need to dare to hit the machine, to move it. It's a bit aggressive thing. So.
That's well put. You need to dare, yeah. Because usually, also when you know it, you don't do it because it's uncommon to do something like that. Yeah, it's exactly. Yeah. And also with the 30s machines, with the Bagatelle thing and the Bagatelle Japonais and so on, they used to be on the table. It was a tabletop thing. And then you can nudge even more, of course. So they needed to become more sturdy in order to get shoved around more. But the pinball machine doesn't really care, you know, because it's built that way. It's built that way that you can shove it around. But if it's just a tabletop thing, it breaks more easily. So that's when they came up with that. And I like also in this book, it's very I don't have it with me right now, unfortunately. But in this visual novel about pinball, you see like the early ideas before they had the tilt panel, the tilt bob, where they stuffed like sacks of sand into the machine so that it gets heavy and that you can't shove it around. But all those things didn't work. But the tilt bob is around for many decades now, so it's really well established. I forgot to mention that when you get a tilt, so when the tilt bob registers 3 times, then the machine says tilt, and then it's over for you. The ball is lost.
3 times.
Yeah. So you can't move the flipper fingers anymore, and you don't get a bonus. In some games, when you drain the ball, when you lose the ball, you get bonus points. There are some games where the bonus points are extremely important. If you want to do a high score, because you have like an okay score, and when you get the bonus, your score gets like tripled or something. So when you lose the bonus points, it's a big deal sometimes. But still, when you get the tilt, you don't get a bonus, and the ball is lost. So immediately. And if you play a multiplayer game, so say if we play 4 players, and if I'm the player 2 and I tilt the game, my ball is lost. And if you're player 3, you start your ball. And then this is also interesting when you play in a tournament, because the tilt bob is still moving, because I shoved the machine around and it tilted. And then you know what you need to do. You need to wait. You need to wait until the tilt bob, is in place, doesn't move that much, and then you start playing again. Because there is this thing called a phantom tilt. When you start playing immediately, you get the tilt, although you didn't do anything. You know, it was still my thing that I did, but it transferred over to your game, to your ball. Yeah. There are tournaments. There is the International Flipper Pinball Association. This is an international scoring system, if you will. So if you take part in a tournament and you're a registered player, you get like registered at the IFPA, and you get a profile, and then you get points if you finish the tournament with 50 players and you like the 12th best player, you get maybe from 0.5 to 3 points. And then so you collect your points, and then you have your ranking, and people who are playing well and to take part in many tournaments. So it's a grinding thing as well. You get many points, and when you get many points, you rank up within the international list. But the thing is, there is no money in pinball. This is, I think, it's a very sympathetic thing, because you can't read there. There is of course a professionalization. There are many good players who also take part in tournaments. I do as well, not that much, but I was like, in 3 days I'm going to Rotterdam actually, because there is a big pinball tournament. And you get the points and stuff, but you can't really win money. I mean, sometimes like tournament organizers say, okay, the first place gets, I don't know, $200 or something, but you can't, there is no one on earth who can live on playing professional pinball. So
for example, like from the late 70s onwards, how would the pinball games have evolved? How video games?
They would have evolved boringly, because the interesting thing is, when video games were introduced, pinball designers really tried to catch on. They really tried to up their game, And the interesting machines started in the 80s. The machines from the 70s and earlier are actually, I mean, this is a controversial statement for some people. They are kind of boring, But from the 80s onwards, they get really interesting. And why? Because video games were introduced, and they had to up their game. They had to become more interesting, more flashy, more everything.
So why is it actually called pinball?
Oh yeah, why is it called pinball? Because, does anyone know? A little bit. I only briefly talked about it. So yeah, why is it called pinball? Because in the early games, maybe we can see it, because there were pins and balls, exactly. So it's not a very interesting story. So the games from the 30s, who were like the tabletop versions, they were non-electrified. So you had the plunger, you plunged also a small ball into the play field. And then there were the pins where the ball like bounced off about the pins, the ball bounced off the pins. And then eventually it became like the ball was stuck in like a hole or something like that. And then you just counted your points. There was no electrified thing. So the ball, there was maybe a lane on the bottom left where it said like 20 points. And when the ball went there, then you wrote 20 points with a crayon on a sheet of paper. That's how you collected the points back then.
How do you make an international tournament if every machine is so different in place? Like, is there some kind of standard?
The thing with pinball tournaments, that's a good observation. You need to be flexible, because you have to play at certain tables. They are where they will be chosen for you, and then you have to play against another player on the pinball table ABC, and then you have to play this one. And if you don't know the game, then it's bad luck for you, But like good players do it like that. I also try to do that. With your first ball, you try to figure out how the machine plays. What do you have to do? How are the flippers like installed? How does the game feel? How easily or like how hard is it to hit certain targets? And with the first ball, you try to figure out how the machine works. What's the vibe with this game, And with the second and the third ball, you really try to up your game and try to get a good score. But you really need to be flexible, and you should always be modest. Try it out. And sometimes you just lose the first two balls and you don't hit anything. And this happens to the best players. And a really good player just doesn't care. And like he or she plays with the third ball and like rocks everything. And she plays for 10 minutes and has a great score. And you just need one ball to have a good score. You don't need all three balls.
No extra balls.
No extra balls, because usually you can do extra balls too. But in tournaments, they are mostly, almost all the time, not allowed to play. So you just get points instead of the extra ball. And also an important feature I didn't show today is multi-ball. So usually you only play with one ball, but most of the games from the early 80s upwards have one or more multiplayer modes, so you can play with up to 13. There's one machine with 13 balls at the same time. Apollo 13, yeah, Apollo 13, but it's like an oddity. So normally you have like 2, 3, 4, or 5 multi-ball play. That's the common thing. So yeah, you can really dig deep into every machine and try to find some intricacies and how to really hit those targets. And then you figure out, oh, when I hit this target, and then within the next 10 seconds this other target, then I get like double the score, and I didn't know that. Maybe for like 12 years or so, like more intensely. I was always interested in pinball, but I really started playing more like around 2010 when this renaissance started, because it was very interesting to see. And like 8 years ago, a friend and I, we went to the States, to Chicago. Chicago is like the big city for pinball. And we wrote to the companies who produce the pinball machines, and we could actually go into the halls where the pinball machines were produced, which was very interesting, of course. Actually, also for him, because he's a technician, he really knows his stuff. But yeah, it's a very physical thing also to build those machines, obviously. Yeah, but there are a few European producers, but not many. So it's still mostly a US focused endeavor. Yeah.